It's good to see you today. Hope you're having a good day. Come on with us to the book of Acts. We're going to be thinking today about Paul in the storm in Acts chapter 27. And what we're going to be thinking about is why was Paul in the storm? And I wanted to talk about this just because we find ourselves within trials, tribulations, we find ourselves in the storms of life. And some of the points we can make about Paul and his storm, we could make the same points about the storms we find ourselves in as well. So let's get over there and let's begin by reading in Acts chapter 27 at verse 6. Appreciate you tuning in today. Verse 6. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off of Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Uh, and I probably just, by the way, hashed up all the names of those cities, so please pardon me. But anyway, verse 9. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Men, I perceive this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. Now, we don't have time to read the whole chapter. I hope you're familiar with it, pardon me. If not, I would suggest you read it. It is an interesting account, and there are many applications that we can make. But let's just think about, why was Paul in the storm? How would we answer that question? Well, we might say, well, it's time and chance, and that certainly may be the case. Time and chance is spoken about in Ecclesiastes. Time and chance happen to all men. The race is not to the swift. Solomon talks about those things. Sometimes things just happen. It is just time and chance. Sometimes we find ourselves in great difficulties, and there's not necessarily anything sinister behind it. It's not necessarily the devil trying to attack us or things like that. Although I might think about that the Lord works through time and chance and the devil works through time and chance. But anyway, it might just be time and chance. And there may be nothing more to it. There may be nothing more to it. It's just time and chance. Paul being in the storm, and this storm as they sail towards Rome, could it have been just time and chance? Certainly. It could have been. We'll also say this. Another reason that Paul was in the storm is because people have a tendency to not listen. And to look back at our verse, Paul advised them, verse 9, saying, Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. People have a tendency to not listen. We sometimes have a tendency to not listen. Why do we find ourselves in the storms of life from time to time? You might just think about times in your life where you faced great difficulty, and maybe it was time and chance, but maybe you faced great difficulty and maybe someone advised you and you did not listen to that advice. Maybe it was your parents who were trying to help you out and say, you probably don't want to do that. You did it, and what did you find? You found yourself in the thick of it. Maybe it was your friends who were actually trying to steer you a certain way that was better than the way you were heading, and you did not listen to them, and you found yourself in the thick of it. Maybe it was brethren at church, preacher, elders, deacons, whoever it may be. Maybe it's someone at church, and they try to tell you this is not a good idea to keep. It's not a good idea to keep going down that road, and you went down that road and you found yourself in the thick of it. People have a tendency to not listen. Paul advised these people, this is not going to turn out well. They did not listen, and the ship ends up being destroyed. The cargo ends up being destroyed. The people's lives were saved, but they lost the ship and the cargo. Why? Why were they in the storm? because they did not listen. Is time and chance involved? Maybe so, but also, yeah, people just have a tendency to not listen. People are going to do what they want to do, frankly. It might be part of a bigger plan, though. Why was Paul in the storm? And for this, let's look back at the scripture again in Acts chapter 27, and let's come down to verse 24, as they are really in the thick of it at this point. You might look at verse 20. Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. As that was happening, verse 22, I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me, verse 23, for there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. The part I want you to key in on is that business about you must be brought before Caesar. To think about our passage and why was Paul in the storm. Paul is going to be brought before Caesar because in Acts chapter 26, as Paul is on trial and as he's dealing with Agrippa, see what Agrippa says. This man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. The reason that Paul is in that storm, the reason that Paul is in that ship, the reason that they're going to Rome is, frankly, you could go all the way back to when Jesus was talking to Ananias. He is a chosen vessel of mine, talking about Paul. He is a chosen vessel of mine. He will bear my name before the Gentiles and kings. Paul is going to appear before Caesar. God wanted him to appear before Caesar, and he was going to Caesar because he had appealed to Caesar within his trial. Why was Paul in the storm? It's part of a bigger plan. It's part of a bigger plan. Sometimes we find ourselves in trials, tribulations, we find ourselves in the thick of the storms of life, and we need to step back and recognize there is a bigger plan that is bigger than this storm. And we need to keep our eyes open. We need to walk by faith, and we need to be faithful. We need to be faithful. Why was Paul in the storm? Part of a bigger plan. But also, it was part of an unknown plan, too. Look back in our passage. When Paul is saying that, and let me get back over there. Stepped away, didn't I? Back in chapter 27, we read around verse 24, do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. And this is Paul recounting this. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. And that island is going to be Malta. And when they land, when they crash, and as the ship starts coming apart, and they all swim to shore, there they are, and they're on Malta, and the natives showed unusual kindness. Paul does all these things, and all this is happening. What do you think Paul is doing on Malta? As miracles are being done, and we know the purpose of the miracles, it was to confirm the word. Well, what do you think was happening on Malta? You might consider, did the Lord, Paul says, we must come to a certain island, talking about Malta, a certain island. When they launched off in that Alexandrian ship, did they have any intention of stopping in Malta? No. But Paul says we will be saved if we frankly crash the boat, if we go towards that island. It's got to be Malta. Did the Lord want the apostle Paul to come to Malta? I think the answer to that is yes. So why was Paul in this storm? It was part of a bigger plan, Caesar. But was it also a part of an unknown plan? Malta. Getting the gospel to come to Malta. He says we have to come to a certain island. Sometimes we find ourselves in the thick of it. I know I keep using that phrase. Sometimes we find ourselves within trials, and sometimes we recognize it's part of a bigger plan. But sometimes all of a sudden realize, oh, it's part of another plan. It's part of an unknown plan. There are things that we can foresee, like our death, but then things happen along the way that perhaps we did not foresee. And we might meet people who we did not intend on meeting, and what we might be able to have an influence and an effect on them. We might be able, even like Paul was not the only one in the storm. There were a lot of other people on that boat, and a lot of those other people were going to be executed by those Roman soldiers. And because the centurion wanted to save Paul, all those other people are saved as well. I wonder how appreciative they were of Paul. I wonder how all of them were appreciative of the Lord, because they had given up and they thought they were dead men. They thought they were dead men. It's an interesting account. Why was Paul in it? You might think about these points. Could have just been time and chance. Might have something to do with people have a tendency to not listen, but then there might be a bigger plan, and then there might be an unknown plan as well. All in the raging storm. Appreciate you tuning in. Just a little bit of our daily bread. Hope you have a good day. Hope you have a good weekend, and I hope to see you Monday. Thanks for being with us today.